Tackling this housing affordability challenge is enormous. It's absolutely critical to increase housing supply.
Why is there such a large housing supply gap?
Deficit of supply combined with a loss of affordability over the recent couple of years.
What we're looking at in particular is what it would take to get back to pre-pandemic levels of affordability.
What does this mean for the average person in Canada?
We need to build more, and in order to build more, we need to build different.
You're listening to In-House, Canada's housing podcast, where we share the latest on Canada's housing market.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of In-House. I'm Bree Martin. I'll be your host today, filling in for Joelle Hamilton. And today we're tackling the very important topic of Canada's housing supply gap. We'll explore the real magnitude of the challenge and why the need to address the housing supply is such a critical issue. To help us break it down, we've got Iorwerth and Mathieu Laberge, two of CMHC's top economists. Aled and Mathieu, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So let's start with maybe if you could give us a little bit of information about how big the challenge is today and what has changed since CMHC put out its last report on it back in the fall of 2023.
The gap is enormous. We're basically talking about the need to double housing starts. So looking out a few years, we're predicting housing starts maybe 240,000, and we basically need to double that roughly. The magnitude differs across the country. It's particularly large in some of our key cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, but it's increasingly spreading to other cities, including Nova Scotia. So the gap is enormous, but I think the challenge is also important in order to help Canadians get back to affordability. Housing costs have become an enormous challenge. And so it's restricting their mobility. They're spending a lot of money on housing. It's creating challenges for young who want to move into housing. So tackling this housing affordability challenge is enormous. And in order to do that over the long term, I think it's absolutely critical to increase housing supply. There's a lot of changes in this year's report. We have a much more sophisticated modeling, but we're also changing quite a lot of our key goals, parameters, aspirations. What we're looking at in particular is what it would take to get back to pre-pandemic levels of affordability. The resources that we need to build more housing are enormous. So we're trying to establish realistic goals. This is still going to be very challenging. It's a stretch target, but we're looking at what it's going to take to get back to 2019 levels of affordability. So that's one difference. Another important difference is we have to be realistic about the amount of time this is going to take. We had previously discussed how much housing we would need by 2030. We're now very close to that date in terms of building time. It's time to construction, time for approvals is enormous. So we're moving to a rolling 10-year horizon. So we're hoping that this conveys more realistic goals. But it's still an enormous challenge.
And Alan mentioned it's a stretch goal, but I think it's still achievable. Just to give a sense of the magnitude of changes that need to occur, we're speaking that annually we need to build between 430 and 480,000 units a year. That's quite a lot. But when you take a step back and compare that to our estimate of potential capacity for building houses in Canada, it's about 400,000 we came with. And so, as Aled, you said, it's exactly what it is. It's a stretch goal, but it's possible. And the consequence of it being a stretch but achievable goal is we'll actually need to change the way we build houses to make it possible.
So you mentioned that we need to build a lot of houses to address the supply gap. But can you tell me, how did we get here? Why is there such a large housing supply gap in Canada?
Yeah, well, I think it's been in the building for decades. That's what we need to understand collectively. This is not something that happened overnight or even in the past couple of years. It's something that really built out starting in the 80s. You started to see less and less investment in housing in general, and even more into multiple housing, especially purpose-built rental apartment. And for most of the 1990s and even the early 2000s, we were actually in a deficit of building in Canada. What happened, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to come back to that, is since the COVID, the affordability part of that equation actually also blew up across the whole country. It used to be a phenomenon of the large cities, and especially Vancouver and Toronto. Post-COVID is something that's everywhere and touches every Canadian. And so we have the confluence of a long-term phenomenon of deficit of supply combined with a loss of affordability over the recent couple of years. And that makes, the buildup of where we're at now. And so walking it back and making housing affordable for Canadians across the country will take time. It will take, a sustained effort and a significant change in the way we're doing things.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think we've been facing this problem for a couple of decades at least. So the rental fell off a cliff around 1980, rental construction. But the home ownership market has been facing affordability challenges since around 2005, but particularly in Vancouver and Toronto. We've seen demand for housing go up, incomes went up, population growth went up, and the supply system did not respond. So we've been facing this for a long time, and now we need to really get to grips with the supply issue and improve that. It will, as you say, take time, however.
So you both mentioned Toronto and Vancouver. Our latest report also shows that the issue is not just in Toronto and Vancouver. So where do we need to build more houses?
Well, it's becoming a problem more pervasive than those cities. It's becoming outside of Toronto and the rest of Ontario, including in Ottawa. It's becoming an issue in the rest of British Columbia, outside of Vancouver. It's an issue in Montreal. It's an issue in Nova Scotia. So there's been this, as you mentioned earlier, a marked deterioration in affordability since COVID. Demand patterns have changed. People may be wanting bigger housing. The economy has recovered quite strong, particularly in Quebec. So demand for housing has gone up, but the supply system has really not responded. Now, in other places in Canada, in the prairies in particular, there is a lot of supply. There's not as much of an affordability challenge in the prairies, but certainly in several of Canada's key cities, it's a problem.
Yeah, I think you really need to look at it as, something that evolved very quick over the last couple of years. Toronto and Vancouver are kind of face a situation that's apart from many other cities. The build-up in the affordability issues in Toronto and Vancouver has been building up since 2004, 2005, starting in the home ownership in very central areas and spreading out outside the core and in the rental market. But really what made a big difference is COVID. What happened with, increased mobility and remote work, people could actually keep their job in downtown Toronto or downtown Montreal or downtown Vancouver, but work from Halifax or work from Red Deer or wherever really. And so that made possible for households to move around seeking arbitrage where they can actually pay less for their housing cost, but keep the same work. But that also had the effect of spreading the affordability issues across a much larger number of centers, of urban centers in Canada.
If we manage to add supply and try to close the housing supply gap, what would be the impact of this additional supply on house prices and rent?
Well, it's basically to try and limit the growth in how much house prices will go up. We have predictions that house prices without increasing supply will just continue to become more and more unaffordable. So that challenge is there, but there's equally a challenge in the rental system. Rents will continue to rise because of the absence of supply. So if we don't tackle this problem, it just becomes a bigger and bigger problem. debt starts to pile up, and it just becomes a worse problem.
And so keeping that in mind, what is the path forward? How do we actually make a dent in the supply gap?
Well, we need to build more. And in order to build more, we need to build differently. What does that mean? Is more technology. When you look at the leading countries right now in the world that have, the highest supply, but also the most nimble industries, they rely on AI, on machine learning, on off-site building. Also, when we talk about manufacturing or prefab, this is something in Canada that we don't do much. Just an example, in Sweden, 90% of houses have a component that's built off-site. In Canada, less than 5%. We also need to adjust our workforce to the new technologies. So it doesn't mean that we train people the same way. We train in the same technologies either. So people need to learn how to magnify the use of AI and machine learning, and also how to build an assembly line for a house, just as we learned maybe 100 years ago to do it for cars in Canada, which is a thriving industry. And finally, it means also tabling on the resources we have locally and that are highly available. I'm thinking about anything that's a high-rise wood frame, for example. Again, Sweden has about 10 to 20% of their housing stock that's made out of wood. In North America and Canada, it's much lower. It's less than 5% again. And so all this together will both make it easier to build more, but also to build faster. So you both accelerate the volume and the pace of building.
But I think we also need to improve the whole regulatory system. Yeah. So certainly with respect to mass production, the regulation system plays a part there. But we also need to just make the system a lot more flexible, a lot more faster to approve. So I think there's a lot of fundamental changes that are needed and for governments to align on how to increase more housing supply.
Absolutely. And I think there's two ways to change regulation to make it easier and faster for builders to build. First one is also technology, having standardized approaches across municipalities. Right now, a builder that wants to build in municipality B instead of A has to learn a whole new system. And so there's a high cost for them to move from a city to another. And there's also the whole notion of, if we go further in that notion of standardization, there's a whole notion of the internal trade, right? In Canada, we know there's been increasing talks about our internal trade. We need to look back at, making our regulation for housing more standard across provinces, across municipalities, so it's easier for the industry to scale. Because with an industry that can scale, get bigger businesses, then they have more ways to invest in the technologies we need to increase the building capacity.
So we've talked a little bit about the industry perspective, but let's bring this home for our listeners. What does this mean for the average person in Canada who's looking to rent an apartment or looking to buy a house?
Well, the average person looking to rent or buy a house right now is facing a big challenge. Like, not only is it costly, but even finding a place. The vacancy rate in Southern Ontario, Southern British Columbia, is, for all intents and purposes, is close to zero. So they will struggle to find a place to live. And if they find a place to live, it will be very costly. So I think as we're going to repeat, is we need more housing supply so that people can move to Vancouver and find the work that they want. They can move to Toronto and get the job they want, and help the Canadian economy, by the way. So I think for the average person, it means that we're changing the trajectory for house prices and for rents and trying to get them into more housing affordability.
I think what you mentioned here, Aled, is so key, right? Because right now in Canada, people are shying away of better jobs of moving for a better job because they can't make it work on the housing cost side. And this is preventing the Canadian economy of growing and being more productive. And it's a very important challenge we're facing as a nation right now. I think what it means to is that, yes, it will take time, right? This is not something, as we were saying earlier, we can back out decades of undersupply over a couple years. But, there are a lot of incentives. You were speaking about regulation at it. There are a lot of incentives or initiatives right now being put forward to make that change. Housing Accelerator Fund is one, but I know that all levels of government are working together to try to reduce that. There's more to do, but it's already ongoing. I know the industry. There are businesses across Canada that are looking at those technologies. So changes is coming, and we're dedicated bringing the information, bringing the programs to accelerate that change. But yes, it will require some time to see significant changes.
So you've given us a lot of information about Canada's housing supply gap. What would you say are the top takeaways from all of this?
Well, supply is key. This is key to addressing affordability, and we need more housing supply. We increasingly need it across the country. It's not just a Toronto and Vancouver problem. It's in many other provinces now. We need to change the way we're doing construction, doing business in the housing. We need more efficient processes. We need more productivity. And we need all levels of government to support this effort.
Those are some excellent points. A big thank you to both of you for sharing your thoughts and insights. And thank you to our viewers for joining us for another episode of In-House.
Did you know we're not just on YouTube? You can now find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. Don't miss our next episodes for more real, data-driven discussions. If you're learning from and/or enjoying this podcast, please share this episode, follow us, or subscribe. Reach out. Let us know what you think. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.